All right, well, today we continue our discussion of the three transcendentals. Let me get off my little art screen there. Three transcendentals: beauty, goodness, and truth. And today we're on the second, the good. Now, I know so many people cringe when we hear anyone tell us how we should act, or we think they're going to tell us how we should act. Of course we cringe. We all sort of know how we should act. What we are really bothered by, though, I think, is the threat of someone taking away our freedom and autonomy to act and think how we want. But how many of us, let's be honest, how many of us truly act and behave how we want? Don't most of us want to be more loving than we indeed are? Don't we want to think at a higher level in a more controlled way than we actually do? So really, how is our freedom and autonomy working for us? Well, what we discover when we do such self-reflection is that, lo and behold, we need help to be as good as we want to be. We discover that we actually are not completely free, but constrained by some mysterious force, which pushes back at our higher impulses to do good. We don't need to look externally for this force. It's not a political system. It's not an economic system preventing us from being free enough to do the good we want to do. It's something inside. Now, for this art presentation, I want to discuss the good, but I want to focus primarily on how we first discover what is the good. Most discussion around the good or morality generally have an all or nothing quality to them. Either the good is clear and it's knowable to everyone because, well, God gave it to us. We have the 10 Commandments, or we have a law code from our government instructing us. Or morality is entirely subjective, which often leads to this, the anarchy. Here are a couple of quotes that together, I think, sum up the modern predicament with knowing the good. Fyodor Dostoevsky, some of you have read his works. If you haven't, he's one of the greatest writers ever as far as the psychological depth of his works. He said, without God, all things are permissible. Do you believe that? Well, let's couple it with this quote. Without God, all things are permissible. But then from Friedrich Nietzsche, we learned that God is dead. So if both of these quotes are true, then Houston, we have a problem. We fix this problem by creating societies where laws approximating the good, I underline that in my notes, approximating the good are created and enforced. But we still require a court system because not everyone agrees on the laws, nor how to interpret the ones we do agree on. Now, here's how we traditionally try to solve the problem of interpreting the good. We posit an absolute good, like the 10 Commandments. An absolute good makes things really simple. It has a clear reference point and does not consider the situation at all. It's an always or never understanding of the moral good. For example, it is always wrong to kill someone, regardless of the situation. That's an absolute view. Well, that didn't stop this man from plotting to kill someone. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor, theologian, and anti-Nazi dissident who was a key founding member of the Confessing Church. He was arrested by the Nazi police for plotting to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Today, we consider him a good person. Some even think of him as a saint. So obviously, few of us, I think, would follow an absolutist view of morality. And so that brings us to the second perspective on morality. An objective good also has a clear reference point that we can look to know what is good. But the difference with absolute standards is that the objective considers the situation. So yes, it is wrong to kill someone unless that someone is Adolf Hitler. That would be an objective morality. And then finally, subjective. The subjective good. It's determined by the subject, the person, It is a personal opinion. Now, the obvious problem with this perspective is the question, what are the grounds for punishment if someone deviates from our standard of the good? Well, there are no grounds, actually, unless we take matters into our own hands. If I have power over you and can carry out my arbitrary punishment, I think few of us are in the subjective category when it comes to morality. That is why many of us believe in an objective good. Still, there's the problem of determining a reference point that we can all agree on. For many cultures over long periods of time, it has been the good as determined by sacred texts, which were believed to be divinely revealed. Who can argue with a moral code given by God, right? But most modern, educated people view morality, and more specifically, the idea of a universal good, from a rationalistic perspective. So it's obvious to us, rational people, that people over time and across cultures have had different ideas about what is good, including what is in our sacred text. For example, take genocide. Today, the practice is against the Geneva Code and international law. I think all of us listening see the practice of genocide as on the opposite spectrum of the good. Maybe I'm wrong to assume that, but I don't think so. I remember when I first read as an adult the account of the slaughter of the Amalekites in the Hebrew scripture, 1 Samuel 15. I was shocked. Here are the two key verses. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now, the Amalekites had apparently attacked the Hebrew people unprovoked during their exodus from Egypt. And I think they've been accused of being a wicked people as well. But genocide as the punishment? That's a little harsh, don't you think? And not even the livestock were spared. But genocide was considered just retribution in the ancient world. Many ethnic groups practiced it. In fact, we saw it in Rwanda not very long ago. But most nations in the world consider it off the table as a military option. It is no longer acceptable. We, as an earthly community, have changed our views. So it's clear from this example, and I could have chosen several other examples, that our sense of what is the good, and thus what deviates from the good, has changed over time and cross-culturally. So morality is entirely subjective and relative, right? Well, wait a minute. How many of us believe genocide was not a deviation from the good 3,000 years ago? Do any of us believe it was wrong then, just as it is wrong now? And what happens when we watch the news? What do you think when you hear about female circumcision or honor killing? Do any of us believe this is simply a difference in cultures? Or do some of us, maybe all of us, believe such practices are not morally permissible at any time or in any place? If we don't believe they are permissible at any time or at any place, then we must be judging such practices based on an idea of the good that is universal, that is transcendent. Isn't that so? The reality is, it is very, very difficult to live consistently in a world where a common idea of a transcendent good is not upheld. Sometimes rational thought and lived experience don't mesh. So where did this idea then of a universal, transcendent good begin? Well, let's start where we started with when we discussed transcendent beauty. Plato and those influenced by him, namely all of us, even though he lived almost 2,500 years ago. Plato posited that the ultimate source of all ideals and being is what he called the one, or sometimes described as the good, the highest form of all the forms. Now, the Christian people who studied Plato just made the good God, but they followed Plato's ideas. His definition of the good is a perfect, eternal, and changeless form, existing outside space and time. It is a Platonic ideal, of course. This form is the basis for understanding all other forms. It is what allows us to understand everything else. Therefore, this good, capital G, good, is transcendent, above all else. Now that sounds fine and good, except how can we know he's right? How did he know he was right? How can he make such a claim? Where did this idea come from? Was it divinely revealed, say in a dream or a vision? Maybe the source of all ideal forms is entirely amoral. And by amoral, I mean that the ultimate source of all being, or being itself, has no moral attributes. It's simply dumb, impersonal energy, which created through a process of randomness. This is what most scientists posit today. So Plato's ideas of a universal transcendent good have come under criticism, not just in modern times. In fact, criticisms of his idea of a transcendent good were critiqued by his number one student, Aristotle. Aristotle and all those who built on his thought came up with the idea of natural law. Aristotle argued that all created things, plants, animals, you and me, have a telos, or a purpose. An oak tree is meant to grow tall, grow branches with leaves. That is its telos. When something happens to it, like a disease that does not allow it to grow straight and tall with large branches full of leaves, we say the disease is a deviation from the good, as far as the oak tree is concerned. Now, the bacteria creating the disease might think it's discovered the good for itself, but you get Aristotle's idea, okay? So what was the telos of human beings, according to Aristotle? He came up with a word called eudaimonia. It's often translated well-being or flourishing. Well-being or flourishing, that's our purpose. That's what a human being is supposed to do while on earth. For Aristotle, through careful observation, he saw that what brings about this well-being and flourishing is a happiness that is the natural result of leading a meaningful and virtuous life. So the natural law, as our universal reference point, shows us that for human beings, the good is whatever causes human flourishing. Now still, even with natural law, we end up with a problem when we assume our own good corresponds exactly to an ideal good, the good. This assumption was used to justify colonialism. European cultures thought they had the highest culture, and they were going to spread this good to other cultures. It seemed quite natural and good to bring European civilization to the far parts of the world. There are many people today who still believe colonialism was a good thing. I've watched their lectures. So maybe this isn't maybe the best example, I guess, but the point is that there doesn't appear to be a good, perfect answer to our own question of how we determine the good, capital G good. However, I think the idea of evolution can help us. First of all, it explains why the moral good has changed over time. One of my favorite philosophers is Richard Rorty, the modern pragmatist. He passed away, I think, in 2007, so he hasn't been around, but he was one of my favorite philosophers. As an atheist, he was a moral relativist. All values, he thought, are human constructs and evolved as we continue to socially evolve. But one need not be an atheist to use evolution as a guide to the good. There's a marvelous essay in his book, Philosophy and Social Hope. The essay is titled Ethics Without Principles. Ethics without principles. And by principles, He means Plato's ideal forms, namely the ideal good. In the essay, Rorty describes his own view of morality as an ever greater expansion of our sympathies. I gave you a diagram on the right there to help you with that. An ever greater expansion of our sympathies. I love that definition of morality. So way back when we first stopped dragging our knuckles on the earth and stood upright, we were about our own survival. Me, myself, and I. That's as far as our sympathies extended. And yet soon, our sympathies expanded to our immediate family. Then our sympathies expanded further to include our tribe or clan, and then our nation. But if we're really going to be moral, then our sympathies should expand out to include all the people of the earth. Then all of those creatures in the web of life, like different species of animals. And of course, we finally include the needs of plant life and rivers and mountains. And so we ask, what would cause rivers and mountains to flourish and act accordingly? Rorty would say his choice of such an ethic of the good is merely aesthetic. It's simply more attractive to live the way he describes, an ever expansion of our sympathies. I would say, though, it's attractive because it developed over time from our traditions, including our spiritual traditions, just like a taste for a particular food or art or music develops over time. The food, for example, has a history within a cultural tradition that plays a role in our wanting to develop a taste for it in the first place. And that is why we have a tendency to look back in order to find what is good, namely to our traditions, to our upbringing, to our religions and books, religious books, to sacred texts, which usually were written long ago and in a different cultural setting than our own. And we find solace when we discover the good which has endured. The good expressed from the past that most people still find attractive today. Such ideas of the good endure for a reason and take on the color of truth, even transcendent truth. For example, the good of charity. Does that ever go out of moral style? The good of healing. The good of generosity. The good of peace. The good of patience. The good of kindness. The good of sacrificial love. These goods we were taught by our traditions, by the authorities of our past, and they have endured. But we also know through study that some goods have changed over time and place. The good has clearly evolved. Yet that doesn't mean we discard our great moral traditions. Remember our discussion about Ian McGilchrist's work on the left and right hemispheres? The right hemisphere is characterized by openness to the environment. Well, that is great for taking in the broadest amount of data and creating meaning from it. But at some point, selection is needed, which is what the left hemisphere does well. We need to select the good at some point and live in light of that good. I'm sure we all know people who say that the point of life is the journey. They are seekers, which is an exciting, adventurous way to live, until they experience chronic emptiness, because they never stop to enjoy the fruit of being in a particular place, taking time to build some emotional and psychological stability. That is what discovering the good brings to our lives: emotional and psychological stability, which allows the greatest opportunity to flourish. As you know, I'm a seeker by nature and can look back on times in my life where I experienced what I just described. I was pursuing knowledge all the time, but never wanted to take hold of anything I discovered for too long, lest it anchor me to a particular spot or way of thinking and prevent me from moving on in my adventure. There was an emotional and spiritual cost I paid for that kind of life. Some of the most miserable people I know describe themselves as spiritual, not religious. I once described myself as spiritual, not religious. From my own experience, I can say that for some who describe themselves that way, being spiritual, not religious, is actually code for being a seeker of the good, but not truly wanting to ever find the good. Seeking the good, but not truly wanting to find the good, lest finding mean I actually had to commit to something greater than myself, and thus lose my sense of moral freedom and autonomy. You see, when we discover something truly good in the world, it makes a claim on us. It's as if an image of self-sacrifice, a story of loving an enemy, acting graciously toward a person or group we instinctively despise, carries a powerful whisper with it. Go and do likewise.